So other people have done this, I know. There are some Tolkien scholars, some Tolkien experts who have delved deep into the lore of J.R.R. Tolkien and come up with ways that the Rings of Power could be told, could be created into a show that was more faithful to the books and to Tolkien's writing, the appendices of the Lord of the Rings and so forth. Uh, what I would say, what I would say for the first season or two, that would make sense instead of what we got. I'm not going to try to retrofit what we got because what we got is fundamentally broken. I've seen people take the events of this story with the mithril and everything else and rework them so that they actually make sense, so that characters make logical and in-character choices, so that things are more plausible and believable. But I find that this entire season and virtually everything in it is wrong. It is not the story that should be told about the forging of the Rings of Power, primarily because it barely focuses on the Rings of Power to begin with. First of all, I would say let's not compress the timelines quite so much. A little tinkering with the Second Age's timeline makes perfect sense. It's absolutely understandable. We're talking about an age that lasts over 3,000 years. And to cover all of that would be preposterous. But there are certain flashpoints within the Second Age that would make a lot of sense to cover. And one of those, of course, is the Coming of Anatar, and the work that Anatar, Celebrimbor, and the Elven Smiths do, forging the Rings of Power. You know, the name of the show, the Rings of Power. So this takes place between 1500 and 1600 Second Age. So right dead center in the middle of the Second Age, Sauron has already returned to Middle-earth, but in this story he comes to the elves as Anatar, disguised as a herald of the Valar. And comes bearing, knowledge and gifts, and is immediately mistrusted by many of the most powerful elves, like Gil-galad and Galadriel and Elrond. The high elves of Lindon do not like or trust Anatar, and send him on his merry way. He then goes to Eregion, where he meets Celebrimbor, and Celebrimbor, grandson of Feanor, is a whole different beast. He is, an ambitious and cunning man, elf man. And together they forge the Rings of Power. They forge the 9 rings and the 7 rings, all of which eventually go to the men, the kings of men, and the dwarven lords. And this would be my first season. The relationship between Anatar and Celebrimbor, and why it clicks, and what it's all about. Now, we're talking between when Anatar arrives and they begin making the rings and leaves, we're talking about a 90-year period of time. Now, you could have 90 years take place amongst elves without it being 90, without it having to show 90 years. The time moves differently for elves, and if this was an almost entirely elf-focused season, you could just sort of compress that time and make that work within 90 years, still have it be 90 years. Alternatively, you could compress it and make it shorter. I think it would work either way. You could even just ignore the time to some degree and just have this season focused on this process, which would be a lot of character drama, a lot of relationship drama, a lot, relationship as in these two, Anatar and Celebrimbor, and their relationship would have to be a major crux of this season. We could have some other elves like Galadriel and Gil-galad and Elrond show up around the periphery in the beginning and the end especially, but in this first season, I think Celebrimbor would have to be a very, 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 very major figure. And the other thing I would do with this season is begin to introduce those 9 kingdoms of men and the 7 kingdoms of dwarves, who will eventually come under Sauron's gaze, right? Especially the Nine Rings of Men, right? They are going to be this is the origin story also of the ring wraiths and the Nazgul. So, one thing that the season 1 of Rings of Power has failed at, other than just totally botching the forging of the rings, where they start with the 3 elven rings, which actually are forged at the end, just before the One Ring is forged. And those 3 are actually forged by Celebrimbor himself without Sauron around. He's not aware of them being forged, whether Celebrimbor was purposefully deceiving him or just trying to do it on his own with what he'd learned, or what. This is up for interpretation. But then, it's not until Sauron goes back to Mordor and forges the One Ring, and then that the elves realize that they were deceived. And that could be the end of the first season. It could be the start of the second season. But the thing about the first season of Rings of Power, other than botching this forging of the rings, is simply that they don't introduce any of the world itself. What are these 9 kingdoms of men? All we see are Numenor, which is not included in this, and the Southlands, which is just made up and becomes Mordor and covered in volcanic ash and flame and lava and all that shit. So we're not even introduced to sort of any of the real players in this story. Who becomes the Witch King? Where are these kingdoms that are corrupted? What is this? The world of the Second Age is very different than the world of the Third Age. The Third Age, in a lot of ways, is sort of a fallen age, right? All these kingdoms of men have fallen. Only Gondor remains, really, and Rohan, but very few. Kingdoms of men remain. Many great civilizations have fallen. The elves have retreated back into their holdouts. The dwarves are much diminished. Durin is gone. Durin's bane has come. All these things have happened by the Third Age that aren't there in the Second Age. The Second Age at this point would look very different, and yet they show very, very little of it in Amazon's adaptation. So I would have this story, the initial season or 2 or so of this show, be about the forging of the rings and introducing us to, you could make up a lot of characters for this. You could make up a lot of characters who become, the 9, who are these 9 ring wraiths? What are their stories? What are the dwarven civilizations beyond Durin and Khazad-dûm? What are those like? There are 7. What are they? Then you can have, in the second season, Sauron coming to Eregion and sacking the city and torturing Celebrimbor and trying to, and finding the rings and taking all of them except for the elven rings, which are hidden. You can have that, and you can have, and then eventually you get to later seasons where you skip ahead in time because the elves can still be around, except for the ones who are no longer around. But characters like Galadriel and Elrond and whatnot are going to still be around, and you get to Numenor, and you get to the rise of Ar-Pharazôn, who becomes a great general, who takes his enormous and powerful army to defeat Sauron, and such a vast army that Sauron's forces abandon him in the field, and he is taken prisoner and brought back to Numenor, where he slowly corrupts Pharazôn and corrupts the Numenorean civilization. And then you have the faithful like Elendil and Isildur who, don't go along with these crazy plans to steal immortality back from the Undying Lands and all the consequences of that, and the fall of Numenor and the rise of Gondor and so on and so forth. There's a whole drama there to be told in a couple of seasons that could be incredible, but this requires you not to. I mean, yes, they could still do this in the show, and they're trying to do it all at once, right? They've somehow created a whole first season where instead of going about the forging of the rings, that all happens in the last 15 minutes and skips the majority of the Rings of Power. I wonder if because they have kept Elrond and Galadriel quiet about Halbrand's real identity, if he will somehow come back, and in season 2 we'll get Halbrand and Celebrimbor forging the other rings, but it's all out of order and it's all jumbled, and we have the whole Numenor plotline happening congruently at the same time, concurrently. I always say that wrong. At the same time as this story, which makes it very confusing as to what happens next, when this happens, what the order is. Because with Isildur already alive, that means that the One Ring is forged, and within a human lifetime, the last alliance of men and elves takes place, and Sauron is defeated, and the ring is chopped from his finger by Isildur, who fails to throw it into Mount Doom, and then it, is lost time until Gollum finds it. So all of this is going to happen in one generation. The ring, all the rings are forged. The Nazguls have to be, the ring wraiths have to be corrupted and created. All of this has to happen by the time, emo Isildur over there turns like 40 years old. I mean, we're talking like 20-something years tops. Probably they won't even age him up. It'll all happen within a couple years. Oh, the forging. All the power of that ring, Sauron's going to have it. He's going to have it for like 2 years. It diminishes. It's the same thing with fast travel, with making armies and other things move so quickly in relation to the other events. You can have armies. Quick aside, I've had people say, "Oh, look, in the Lord of the Rings, armies move quickly from one place to another," and it's like, well, they use filmmaking techniques to show us that time has passed throughout the story, rather than it looking like in one story things are going very slow, and in another story they're teleporting great distances. There are ways to convey the distance traveled and the time passed without actually literally making that much time pass, right? But anyway, so it's a mess. Where it is now is a mess. I wrote an actual final season 1 review, but I thought I'd accompany it with this the way I would, this is just broad stroke stuff. This is just saying I would just take what Tolkien already did, his notes and whatnot, and I would tell these essentially two stories: Forging of the Rings. Well, 3 stories: the forging of the rings and the corruption of the men and the world through the power of the rings and the One Ring, the fall of Numenor, and all of that, the war against Sauron and the fall of Numenor, the destruction of Numenor, the sinking into the sea, and then the faithful fleeing, and then the last alliance of men and elves. So you have your first act is the elves and their conflict with Sauron. Their second act is the humans and their conflict with Sauron, and the final act is the elves and the humans coming together in the last alliance and finally defeating that guy, but not completely because of Isildur's failure to throw the ring. And then you set up the Third Age. Boom, easy. This is how this is how you do it, and you can embellish a great deal. You can do a lot with it that aren't. Obviously, since this is a pretty bare bones sketch by Tolkien, you can do a lot to fill in the gaps, the narrative gaps with characters and interesting drama and relationships and conflict and all sorts of things. You can do all of that. That's where the creative adaptation process comes into play. But you already have. I mean, this idea is just already what's there. This is what's there. Take it, run with it. That's how you adapt something. It doesn't have to be a 1-to-1 ratio. You can make changes. Again, I will look over at House of the Dragon. They've made some changes. Some are better, some are worse. But you can argue them within the framework, at least, of the original text and how it's been adapted. Same with Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings. I didn't like some of the changes he made. Especially in the third movie, I felt like there were some pretty egregious changes or just the scouring the Shire being left out. And so on and so forth. There's lots of things that I would personally, if I had $1 billion and I could make an adaptation of The Lord of the Rings, there's a lot of things I would do differently than Jackson. But at least you can take those movies and they are a recognizable version of what happens in the books. And so you can take those movies and you can debate, oh, I wouldn't have made that change, but that change was good, or I wish he'd done this and not that. You can debate it within the framework of The Lord of the Rings, whereas in Rings of Power, there's almost nothing recognizable there from Tolkien's work. The entire Harfoot, Stranger, Three Witches storyline, none of it was there. The creation of Mordor, nothing. That was not in Tolkien's work. That's not how it happened even remotely. The Mithril storyline, made up wholesale by the creators of this show. Galadriel's involvement with Sauron, bringing him to Eregion, made up for the show. The way the rings were forged, made up for the show. Halbrand himself as a character, made up for the show. All of it, almost every single thing was made up for the show, not based on anything to do with Tolkien. And this is what I would ask people who are like, you're just being you're an anal Tolkien Nazi. You're just a Tolkien fanatic. It's like, please, will you find some books that you loved as a child or even as an adult, some story that you would love to see adapted. Now imagine that was taken and that everything about it, the bedrock of its story, all the backstory of its characters, was changed, fundamentally altered for no good reason. Not adapted, not changed so that it fit the screen better, but just completely thrown out the window and replaced with something else. Now, how would you feel about that? How would you feel about that? And how would you feel if people were just like, oh, you're just being a Nazi, you're just being a fanatic, you just, you don't like anything. And these were people who didn't love this thing. These are people who came in and were like, no, I love this. This is totally Tolkien. I've never read Tolkien, but look, there's a line from the Lord of the Rings movies in there, so now it's super Tolkien-esque. So that's all I would say about that. Anyways, I'm going to stop rambling now. I've rambled long enough. I will link to my Season 1 review in the description below, so please, if you'd like to check that out, do. And like, subscribe, blah, 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 blah. Peace.